On this episode of Newt's World, in his new book, While Israel Slept, Yaakov Katz tells the gripping inside story of how Hamas, Israel's weakest enemy, succeeded in launching a surprise attack on one of the world's most powerful militaries. Through a detailed examination of the events leading up to October 7, 2023, Katz exposes the intelligence and strategic failures that enabled this devastating invasion. He explains how years of complacency, mistaken intelligence analysis, and a misguided policy of containment enabled Hamas to prepare for an assault that Israel did not believe was possible and that would change the Middle East. Katz unveils the dramatic events the night before the attack, highlighting the cracks in Israel's military and political leadership, and provides unprecedented details on how key warnings were missed. While Israel Slept offers a sobering account of how overconfidence and complacency paved the way for disaster, while underscoring the critical lessons Israel must embrace to safeguard its future. Here to discuss his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome back my guest, Yaakov Katz. He is the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He writes for Newsweek and the Jewish Chronicle, hosts the JPPI weekly podcast, and has appeared on CNN and BBC. Yaakov, welcome and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It's great always to be with you.
If you start with some current events, several countries, including Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, are preparing to formally recognize Palestine at the 80th UN's General Assembly. From your standpoint, what does this mean for Israel?
Look, this is a very complicated and dangerous period, to some extent, politically and diplomatically for Israel. As the war in Gaza drags on, almost nearing the 2-year anniversary, which will be coming up in just about a month on October 7th, Israel finds itself today increasingly isolated on the global stage. All of Western Europe pretty much has walked away from Israel and has said that they no longer support Israel's war, that they want the war to come to an end. And Israel's only real ally today in the world that it can rely on is the United States and is the administration of President Donald Trump that continues to stand with Israel despite what can only really be described as a diplomatic tsunami with all these countries like France, the UK, Spain, Belgium, and others, Canada, Australia, who are all threatening and saying that they plan to unilaterally declare their support for an independent Palestinian state. And while there's definitely legitimacy to some extent in their vision of what they would like to see happen one day in this land and in that battle that has gone on for, I think, for everybody too long between Israel and the Palestinians, to do this now, Mr. Speaker, to give recognition today to the Palestinians of their state is to reward terrorism. Think of Hamas for a moment. Hamas is still holding 48 hostages, 20 believed to hopefully still be alive. They are still holding on to the Gaza Strip and trying to survive and remain the governing entity. And Hamas says, one second, the world is with us and against Israel. We still have the hostages. Why would they end the war? What incentive do they have? Israel is isolated. We might as well continue what we're doing. I think it's not just dangerous, it's very stupid policy.
This whole thing exploded on October 7th, and I was really surprised, given the scale of the training and the preparation, that it hadn't been picked up. You're pretty tough. You write, the Israeli government and military failed the people of Israel on October 7th, 2023. In your view, what was the core of this? What was the most consequential failure?
I went into this because just as you were surprised, and I think so many people around the world were surprised, I, someone who has been writing about the Israeli military for the last quarter of a century, has written multiple books on the military, has had probably, the greatest access that a journalist can have into the corridors of decision-making in the defense establishment and in the political echelon. And I was just shocked. How did this happen? To even magnify the question or amplify it, we look at what Israel did with Iran recently in June when it took out its uranium enrichment facilities, created aerial superiority, eliminated a large batch of their ballistic missile capabilities. We look at what Israel did against Hezbollah with the pager attacks and how that decimated that terrorist organization. Israel has amazing capabilities. So what happened here against the weakest of enemies, Hamas, the one that was just supposed to be a nuisance, the one that we believed we could contain in Gaza? How did we not see what was happening? I've come to call it the fairy tale, that Israel started to believe in a fairy tale, that you could live alongside a genocidal terrorist organization on your border that calls for your destruction, that says it's coming to abduct people. It's coming to commit the worst atrocities we know. And we, the people of Israel, the government, the military, say, no, you don't mean what you're saying. You want money. So we'll arrange and organize for the Qataris to bring in suitcases of cash. No, you don't mean what you're saying. You just want people from Gaza to come into Israel and work. We thought we knew better than what they were openly saying. What they declared is what they ended up doing. We were looking for so many different pieces of intelligence. It was all out there. They were telling it to us, but we weren't willing to listen. So when I look at the failure, to me, it's institutional, it's systematic, it's collective, it's everything. It's the politicians who set the policies, who believed that you could pay off a terrorist organization. If I told you today that we will end the war and the way we will end it is by giving Hamas every month $30 million, you would think I'm insane. But that's what Israel did for years. Why did that make sense? Now, then people thought it was the right thing. Today, we now know that was crazy. Then people thought, we'll just build up a bigger fence. We'll create the Iron Dome missile defense system. Brilliant. All amazing technology, can swat away rockets like a mosquito. But it only created a false illusion of security. It just kept the threat contained in a specific area until it exploded on our border. So that's what we went on to pursue and to try to understand. How did a country like Israel, which is so vigilant when it comes to national security, how did it fall asleep at the wheel?
Were there indicators that were pretty clear that were just ignored, or did they not pick up the indicators?
We go into great detail in the first chapters of the book. What happened exactly between October 6th and October 7th? What was going on through the night? It seemed in the beginning of the immediate aftermath of the attack that Israel was completely taken by surprise, knew nothing, that nothing was amiss, nothing was happening, nothing was being planned. And what we discovered through reporting and meeting with all the different officials, there was a flurry of activity in pretty much the 24 hours preceding. Already on Friday, there were indicators that something was off. There was the Hamas fighters in Gaza who took out their Palestinian cellular SIM cards and replaced them with Israeli cellular SIM cards. This was all because if they're crossing into Israel, they need to be able to remain in touch and contact and have communications. That what this did was it would have enabled them to do that. Why did suddenly 100 Israeli SIM cards go live on the grid in Gaza? During the night, there were indications and alarm bells went off of rocket launchers underground being uncovered. There were reports of bunkers being prepared for the top Hamas commanders, like Mohammed Def, the elusive, mysterious military commander. There were many different indications. There were reports that had been collected in the weeks running up to October 7th by those female surveillance soldiers who sat along the border watching what was happening in the area of operations, and they saw that things were off. Things were different. More people were coming to the border, different people that weren't usually there. And it was all there, but it wasn't digested the right way. It wasn't analyzed the right way. What had happened, the chief of staff of the IDF was speaking with his generals. The head of the Shin Bet, the intelligence agency, was talking with his division commanders. And they were all trying to process what was happening. And the real dilemma was, is this a drill or is this an attack? And if it is an attack, what is the scale and scope of the attack? But in the end, They didn't make the right decision, and they fell on the side of this potentially being just a drill.
There's a pattern you see in some campaigns where one side engages in a behavior over and over until it becomes normal, and nobody takes it seriously. But in fact, what they're doing is they're preparing for the attack. It's just that they look like we've seen them do that before. To what extent was Hamas actually modeling what it was going to do in a way that was seen over time but just discounted?
By the way, you're 100% right, because when we look back now and we can do the autopsy, so-called, we see that Hamas was doing activity along the border. Those were those protests. They were flying kites across the border. They were sending projectiles across the border. They were sending hundreds, if not thousands of people to burn tires next to the border. What they were doing, we now know, was normalizing being alongside the border. And that got Israelis to think, the Israeli security forces, it's not out of the ordinary if they're getting too close to an area that in the past they would never get too close to. That was one. The second thing that they did was they built these mock bases inside the Gaza Strip, which they created and used to drill and to train for raiding military bases and what that would look like and how they would abduct soldiers. And it seemed more sometimes like it was just a theater, like it wasn't real. Because the idea that Hamas would be able to cross in such a way was seen as so far-fetched as never being possible. You know, you talk about the tunnels inside Gaza as an example. Israel's whole focus, and we tell this in the book, was about the cross-border tunnels, the tunnels that were potentially could cross into Israel and be used to then infiltrate, carry out terrorist attacks, potentially kidnap soldiers and bring them back to Gaza. But inside the tunnels inside Gaza, Israel never focused on. It focused all its efforts on stopping those cross-border tunnels, but not the hundreds of miles of tunnels that were literally dug all throughout, crisscrossing the Gaza Strip. Why was that? Because it wasn't seen as a threat. What would ever happen? Why would Israel ever need to deal with that? No one ever imagined that you'd have 250 people who would be held by Hamas inside those very tunnels. So when the war began and Israel launches its offensive towards the end of October of 2023, it knew that there were tunnels everywhere. It knew that homes had hatches. But just because you know where the hatch is doesn't mean you know what the route of that tunnel is. Now you got to go map it all out. And still today, almost 2 years into this war, Israel is continuing to discover tunnels that did not know of their existence inside Gaza. And I know that sounds crazy when you think about how much time Israel has operated there, how long it's been there, what it's done there, and it still be surprised shows just how extensive this was by Hamas.
Are you a little surprised that after 2 solid years of war, we have not had greater success?
I'm not overly surprised because I think what we have seen is the way that Hamas created its infrastructure, the way it embedded itself in civilian infrastructure, just how protected it created for itself to have its bases and its main command posts under hospitals, schools, inside homes, under homes. This is super complicated. Now, I also think that had there not been hostages, the war could have ended much earlier. The hostages added a whole other dimension of complexity because you and I could have had this conversation on October 8th. And you could have said to me, you know what, Yaakov? The war will end in a victory. Israel will get back the hostages, but Hamas will unfortunately remain in control of Gaza. And I would say to you, Speaker Gingrich, that's crazy. And I could have said to you, Mr. Speaker, we're going to win the war because we're going to bring down Hamas. They're no longer going to control Gaza. We will destroy them, but the hostages will be lost forever. And you could have said to me, Yaakov, that's crazy. The hostages added a complexity that there's no possibility for an end to the war and a victory for Israel without retrieving them and bringing them home. So even if Israel says, look, I've done enough militarily, I have degraded Hamas to the greatest extent possible, and now is the time to insert the political resolution, because as we know, military is just a way towards the political resolution. We can't do that as long as hostages are still there. Israelis cannot move on from this as long as hostages are still there.
So why do you think Hamas has been so desperately sustaining hostages in ways that if the world was even a tiny bit fairer, the brutality and the horror of the hostage treatment by Hamas would condemn them permanently? And yet they do things that have to be totally alienating from an Israeli standpoint.
Hamas is very much focused on how it can survive this war. That is its ultimate objective. I think tragically what we've seen happen is that Hamas does not care about the people of Gaza. It does not care about the infrastructure in Gaza. And from its perspective, the more people who die and are killed, the better it is, because this leads to the isolation of Israel, to the condemnation of Israel, to Israel being dragged before the ICC and the ICJ and the criminal courts all over the world. This is what Hamas wanted. And Hamas continues to hold on to a belief that potentially it can outlive this, and it can survive this campaign by Israel against the terrorist infrastructure in Gaza. The hostages are something of an insurance card, and they are held by Hamas, which believes that as long as it has had these hostages in its hands, Israel's hands will be tied, and what Israel is able to do will be severely limited. The issue, though, I think that we have to keep in mind, and this leads us to actually where we are right now in this war, is that Israel, which is on the verge potentially of an offensive now in Gaza City, which is highly criticized by different people, especially the families of the hostages, who say, why are you expanding the war when you should be making a deal and bringing our loved ones home? They're right, but at the same time, the prime minister is right when he says we need military pressure to even get Hamas to agree to a potential deal. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's very complex.
In your mind, is it, for all practical purposes, impossible to destroy Hamas?
I think it's possible. You can never destroy every fighter. You can never collect every Kalashnikov AK-47. You can't kill the ideology out of people. But what you can do, I believe, is achieve potentially two objectives. One, you can degrade them to the level at which they will no longer have the desire to fight. And they understand that it is no longer in their interest, and they no longer have the capability to really do anything. You will still need an entity, whether it is you, Israel, it's a new governing entity, whatever that entity is, you need someone on the ground who is going to prevent them from rebuilding and reconstituting. But there's another thing that is just as important, and that is the deradicalization that has to take place in Gaza. You have to de-radicalize it. That requires changes to the education system, to the culture, institutions, to the political establishment. It's almost a generational shift. De-radicalization has to come with this war, because if they won't make the decision on their own to de-radicalize, it will have to be forced on them. And that's very difficult to do. So you have to hope that through the military victory, that they've been beaten so badly, they will willingly or maybe be more complicit to undergo that de-radicalization that is needed. We need a generation that is not raised to want to kill me and my kids. Right now, that's how people are taught in the schools of the Gaza Strip. That has to change. We need a generation of Palestinians who aren't celebrating the life of who they call martyrs and you and I would call murderers. That has to change. And until that changes, I don't know how we have the stability that we all want.
Seems to me any negotiation should include de-radicalization. And yet it doesn't seem to me that the diplomats focus on that at all.
The diplomats don't focus on it. And I think that tragically, people in today's world want quick wins. They want quick results and solutions. Because what you and I are talking about, we're talking about something that will take years till it actually changes. Could take 15 years, could take 20 years. But if you really want everlasting peace here and chance for that to last and to exist, you have to insist on it. Because otherwise, if the culture continues, we'll find ourselves back here in 5 years, 10 years. If they're determined to rebuild, they'll get weapons somehow. It might take longer. They might not be able to rebuild to the same force that they had on October 6, 2023. But they'll get close to what they had. And then what? And then we'll be in another war, another conflict? Isn't this the time to potentially end it once and for all? But that has to come with strong leadership on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, and around the world. And right now, unfortunately, what we're seeing, and we started with this, what we're seeing out of Europe, that is not the leadership that's going to lead to that.
Well, I mean, the Europeans are busy appeasing their own Muslim populations. But it seems to me that any long-term solution that isn't just a truce between wars has to involve very profound changes. And since Hamas was founded explicitly on the destruction of Israel, in a very real sense, you're asking them to give up who they are as a matter of identity.
Well, I think what we need to see happen here is for the people of Gaza to recognize that Hamas has only brought upon them disaster. You look at the tragedy that has fallen on Gaza, and it's a tragedy. I have no problem saying that it's tragic what's happened. The destruction, the number of people killed. I don't accept the number that is put out by the Hamas Health Ministry, although as the way they call it in the mainstream media, the Palestinian Health Ministry, the Gaza Health Ministry. No, this is Hamas, people. No one would believe the ISIS Health Ministry or the Al-Qaeda Health Ministry. For some reason, we accept as if it's gospel the Hamas Health Ministry. But even if I go with that number, or even if I don't accept it, there are people who have been killed in the crossfire. Men, women, children. War is terrible. This is why Israel tried to avoid it for so long. It's why Israel fell asleep, fell into a state of complacency, and believed that it might be possible to actually kick the can down the road and not to have to deal with it. But I think that ultimately, I want to hope that the people of Gaza, who had voted for Hamas in multiple elections, who in polling showed continued to support Hamas even after October 7th, maybe they can wake up and change. We could talk about deradicalization, but deradicalization is only possible with decisive victory. It won't happen on its own. You have to beat it out of them.
That will require a continuing level of violence and repression for a pretty long time.
That's the tragedy, or the sad part, at least from the Israeli perspective, if I think about it, is that what it means for the long term are two stark conclusions. One, the war will not just end. This will be a battle that will continue. It will be a battle that will continue because if we look at Israel's national defense doctrine over decades, Israel never really used preemptive military action. It only did so when dealing with nuclear threats. So the bombing of Osirak in 1981, the Iraqi reactor, the bombing of El Kibar in 2007, the Syrian reactor. But it never did it for the conventional threats. It never preempted against the Syrian army or preempted against Hezbollah, which was amassing 150,000 rockets and missiles, or Hamas for that matter. But the lesson of October 7th is you can't live like that. You can't say, oh, I see a rocket, I'll write down where it is, I'll add it to my bank target or target bank, and I'll deal with it one day. You have to deal with it now, because 1 becomes 100, becomes 1,000, becomes 10,000, becomes 100,000. It has to be dealt with now. For the time being, Israel is holding by this new policy. That is the dramatic change that we're seeing now in the region. We're continuing to see strikes in Lebanon even after the ceasefire went into effect in September. This is part of that dramatic shift in Israel's understanding that it can't sit by and let them rearm and reconstitute themselves. But what that means is that my kids are going to have to continue to fight for many years to come, as will many other millions of Israelis. And that's hard to come to terms with, Mr. Speaker, because what it means is that we, the people of Israel who want to see ourselves as part of the Western world, who see ourselves, our cultural ties, our trade ties, it's with the U.S., it's with Europe. We don't consume Indian or Chinese movies and media. We look at ourselves as part of the Western world. But it means that we won't be able to live like that because we are going to have to fight. Someone I once heard a good line, Israelis want to think they live in Luxembourg, but they refuse to recognize is that their neighbors are not France and Belgium. It's Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. These are the countries they have to deal with in their surroundings. You're not going to be Luxembourg when you have those neighbors on your borders.
From your perspective, the next generation or two will still require a level of militancy to be sustained inside a democratic framework in a way which will be sort of a constant strain on the population.
It will continue to be a strain. And it will be a strain because what we're already seeing is the way the reservists are called up. The Israeli army is small, the standing army. It relies on the reserves. And the reserves have been called up and called on in a way that we have never seen before. I have friends, family that have been serving hundreds and hundreds of days since October 7th. What about their jobs? What about their families? And this is not over.
How does that affect the economy? I mean, Israel's had an astonishing economy. Can you sustain that while also mobilizing?
You can't sustain that over time. The Israeli economy is, for the time being, stable, but it won't last. We're seeing a downturn in investment in Israel. Of course, because of the war, who's coming now to Israel to invest? There are pockets of excellence and stories of amazing startup and high-tech exits. There was just 2 in the last year in the $25 billion mark, which were remarkable. One bought by Google, another company bought another one, Palo Alto bought one, but these are huge. But for the long term, when you have tourism non-existent, when you have airlines that are not flying to Israel, still because of the war, when you have investment dropping, it's going to hit the country and it's going to hurt the economy. And when you have people who have lost their jobs because of this reserve service or small businesses that have collapsed because the owners are not able to work, they're only in reserves, this is going to create a new class in Israel. And the economists are very concerned.
One other thing which I think intensified by the pressures of the war, which is that you did have a faction of Israelites who basically argued that they were exempt from everything. They didn't have to serve in the military, they didn't have to pay taxes. My impression is that under the pressure cooker of this continuing intense struggle, that the society has reached a decision that they have to be integrated into the society at large, whatever it does to their religious beliefs. Isn't that a very profound moment in Israeli history?
It's a very profound moment. You're touching on a very difficult moment, too. There is a segment of Israeli society, what are known as the ultra-Orthodox, the strictly observant men and women from the community. There's about now 1.3 million. They make up just over about 13% of Israel's population. Let them live how they want. I think you and I can both appreciate religion and religious observance, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to serve your country, and especially a country like Israel, which is so beaten down and surrounded by so many threats. The historical beginnings were in the founding of the state, when then it was just a few hundred, a few thousand. And David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister of Israel, agreed to a request by one of the leading rabbis, let them stay in their academies and their what are known as the yeshivas. And Israel agreed. And the prime minister, agreed. But that community, because of high birth rate, which is great, right? That's good for the numbers, but it blew up. And with that, the exemption increased. If you look at, for example, my home in Jerusalem, the largest city in the country, about 1 million people, half of the kids who started first grade on September 1st were ultra-Orthodox kids. What that means is that half of the kids in the schools are not going to be serving in the Israeli military right now as the laws are and as the current system is. That's not sustainable. The country can't sustain it. The reservists are being called on in the way that they're being called on because of people who are not serving. That has to change. And I think that what we learned in October 7 is that the military is not big enough. The military needs more soldiers. And there is a sector in society that could step up and could lend its hand. And this is so important today.
Now, as I understand it, the legislation is moving forward.
The legislation is moving forward. It's rocking in a very strong way Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition. Right now, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is on recess, similar to Congress. And it will really shake things that are happening. The question of what happens when they return from that recess just after the Jewish high holidays in October will test whether this coalition can last. And if it can't, we'll go to an earlier election. Elections are supposed to be held in October of 26. But I would predict that they will be held earlier because of this exact issue, because it will be very hard for Netanyahu to keep these people in his coalition, these ultra-Orthodox, and give them a bill that will satisfy them.
Will the opposition parties unite with the other elements of Netanyahu's coalition to pass this kind of legislation?
That I'm not sure. That's a good question. Not many people are like you who know how to rally the votes, whip the votes together. It's not going to be simple. On the one hand, there's an opportunity, and some people in the opposition, Israel's leader of opposition, has actually extended an olive branch of sorts to the prime minister and said, listen, forget about the extremists in your coalition, those on the right and the ultra-Orthodox. We will give you the support from the outside. Make the deal to bring the hostages home and pass the IDF draft bill, and we'll help you pass it, and we will agree together on a agreed-upon date for elections. Netanyahu does not trust him, of course, and that makes sense in politics. But I think what we're talking about is that this war, what October 7th did was not just shake Israel at its core and create trauma and fear of what is to come. And the trauma is still real as the hostages languish in Hamas captivity, but it also highlighted and showcased the real social divisions that we have that have to be dealt with, like this one. We can't neglect and ignore it anymore. Until October 7th, had you asked me, Mr. Speaker, I would have said, it's an issue. We got to deal with it. It's not the end of the world. We'll survive without them. Today, I think it's one of the most important issues for the future of the state of Israel. And if it's not dealt with now, this country will not be sustainable in just a few decades. It just won't be.
Given all the things we've discussed and all the problems, all the challenges, are you an optimist or a pessimist about Israel's future?
I am a total optimist, and I'll tell you why. And my book, While Israel Slept, does focus on the failures and what led to that horrific day and to the war that continues to drag on today. But it's only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the re-engineering of the Middle East that has taken place. Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities have been destroyed. Assad in Syria has been toppled. Hezbollah has been beaten back. Hamas has been degraded. The state of Israel is today more safe and more secure than it was on October 6th from a military perspective. Yes, today we are facing a diplomatic isolation from places definitely in Europe, but I predict that will change, hopefully, please God, when this war is actually over and we bring back the hostages. But I think that this reality on the ground creates amazing opportunities. Can we reach an agreement with the new regime in Syria, as President Trump is trying to broker? Can we reach an agreement potentially with the government in Lebanon, which for the first time ever is trying to rein in Hezbollah and collect the illicit arms that Hezbollah has? Is it possible in the aftermath of the Israeli and American attacks on Iran that a new, better, more robust nuclear deal is possible with the Iranians? And when I look at the region and I see Israel's deterrence restored, its military strength intact, I think that people know that this is a strong country. Yes, it fell. Yes, it was surprised. But in the big picture, in the scheme of things, Israel's winning. So it gives me hope. We need to remain vigilant, but we also have to take advantage of these opportunities. And that requires something that you know a lot about, political leadership. We need politicians who are willing to take those risks and take the decisions, hold the sword in one hand, but keep an outstretched hand that's looking for opportunities with the other. And right now, I don't see it the way it should be. I want to hope that we get there.
That's very encouraging, and largely how I feel. Yaakov, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And want our listeners know they can find out more about your work, which goes on every day. You do an amazing job. I read your material all the time. And all of our listeners can go to your website at yaakovkatz.com and stay up with all the things, because I'm certain as things evolve, you're going to write and analyze and brief us and inform us. So I'm delighted you would take this time.
Thank you so much. It was always great to be with you.
Thank you to my guest, Yaakov Katz. You can get a link to buy his new book, While Israel Slept, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.